Right, so whilst the media continue to chase Gary Lineker, doorstepping him Corbyn style as they did over the weekend, isn't it amazing how they can't do that with the Tories actually running the BBC that have created this mess? Where is the camera in front of Tory boy Richard Sharp, the BBC chairman? Where is he hiding? Why is he getting away with avoiding scrutiny? Is it any wonder, with appointments like his, that impartiality at the BBC has come to mean protecting the Tories? Because BBC chairman and Tory donor aside, you might not know the half of it when it comes to this guy. I'll come on to that in a moment. Lineker's comments over the language used by the Tories to describe migrants and refugees in the language of 1930s Germany, which are completely accurate, have been well documented now. But others at the BBC have got away with far worse because their jibes have been aimed elsewhere. Been aimed at Labour, for example, the likes of Alan Sugar actively telling people the day before the general election to not vote Labour, or urging people to back Boris Johnson because he is, for example, or Andrew Neil voicing his scepticism of climate change as another. Here's one response from the BBC regarding a complaint against Neil that I've had passed to me, where you can clearly see the BBC has no intention of admonishing Neil because he is a freelancer. His Twitter account is a personal one, and the BBC is not responsible for its content. They would also like to point out that on Twitter, Andrew, first name terms, how chummy, states that his views are his own and that he is the chairman of The Spectator, and therefore anything he says relating to The Spectator are related to that publication and not to do with the BBC. Well, let's take a look at Andrew Neil's Twitter profile a second. Not only does it not say anywhere on there that his views are his own, but it does say BBC presenter. Surely that links his account to his professional role then. If you check out Lineker's, he makes mention of his film company, but not the BBC or anything else. Alan Sugar, Andrew Neil, Gary Lineker, they are all freelancers. And according to that complaint response about Neil, that means his social media has nothing to do with the BBC. And the only conclusions we can therefore draw is that either all of this has come about because Lineker attacked government policy and that the government have leaned on the BBC to gag him, or it's because the likes of Richard Sharp, whose partiality is so well documented, as I'll now get on to, that they took matters into their own hands to shut him up and stop him talking about what is a disgustingly cruel and inhumane government policy to ban asylum in flagrant disregard for the Human Rights Act and the Refugee Convention. These are people we're talking about after all. Richard Sharp should never have been found a suitable candidate to become BBC chairman, in my opinion. He is a Tory donor. He has over the years given the Tory party £400,000. Yet Boris Johnson appointed him because the post of BBC chairman is appointed by the government, and it was his government of the day. Yet another reason why the BBC is so beholden to the government of the day, though, because the government of the day functionally engineers it that way. Does it not? It's clear for all to see now, surely. Boris Johnson also went to Sharp repeatedly for financial advice, despite being told not to just before Christmas in 2020, as Sharp was due to be announced as BBC chairman in the new year, 2021. It didn't stop him, carried on. We, of course, now know that Sharp facilitated an £800,000 loan to Johnson, catered for by senior civil servant Simon Case acting as the go-between, because Sharp didn't want to be seen as helping, given the role he was planning on taking up. So there's clear intent and knowledge of partiality happening here. You have to bear in mind what the role of the BBC chairman is at this point. It is their duty, for which they're paid £160,000 a year out of TV licence money, our money, to maintain the independence of the BBC. It's a farce, therefore, the government appoints the role, let alone someone like Johnson who can't lie straight in bed, and for whom corruption has been his wingman his entire life anyway, somebody like Richard Sharp. The BBC chair is also senior in post to the Director General. In Sharp's case, that's former Hammersmith and Fulham Conservative Party candidate Tim Davie, with the power to sack the person in that role. So for as long as Sharp is present, you're guaranteed to have a Tory DG, it would seem. He's also the BBC liaison to Parliament. My goodness, how chummy that must be at times. So how do we get rid of the BBC chairman? The same government that appointed him has the power to remove him. So cue weakling Prime Minister Rishi Sunak on that subject. Nothing to do with me, he says. That was before my time. He was appointed by the government before mine. The process by which he was appointed is under review. So you won't sack him then, because you don't think it's your place to, despite the reputational damage he's caused, and you being the Prime Minister, the person with the power to do just that? Weak. Sunak did mention of the fact that the Independent Appointments Commissioner is reviewing the appointments process over this, which is true. This post is held by a chap called William Shawcross. However, He has had to recuse himself from this investigation because he's also apparently too close to Richard Sharp. If you want to tie Rishi Sunak into all of this mess more directly as well, William Shawcross's daughter is Sunak's head of policy. And Sunak himself, previously of Bankster's Goldman Sachs, you might well know, he worked there under, yeah, you guessed it, Richard bloody Sharp again. Little wonder there's no will to remove him here. But another question that needs asking of Sharp is why he ever wanted to go to the BBC at all. Before he was appointed to the BBC chairmanship, Sharp had been a major donor to the Institute for Policy Research, or IPR. Sounds very think-tanky, doesn't it? It actually isn't one. It's a very vague entity that seems to act as a funding middleman to think tanks, the horrible right-wing Tufton Street types. So basically means anyone funding the IPR is funding right-wing think tanks in a roundabout way, the likes of the Taxpayers Alliance, for example, who have called for the abolition of the TV licence fee. Not something I disagree with per se. What the hell are we paying it for anyway, would be my reasoning right now. I dare say that's very much different from the TPA's reasons, who just want to bring the BBC down, but can certainly be seen as an anti-BBC action by funding such entities. Sharp's charity, the Sharp Foundation, yes, he has one, also funded Quilliam, the disgraced anti-extremism group, and also donated to another right-wing think tank, the Centre for Policy Studies, whilst on its board. Both the right-leaning organisations, so again, that brings into question Richard Sharp's blatant partiality, and that he is anything but impartial and therefore grossly unsuitable to the role of BBC chairman. Massive questions need answering. How was such a blatantly right-wing, biased person permitted to be appointed to BBC chairman to oversee independence there with this track record? Can we trust the inquiry into this when everyone linked to it so far seems to have ties to Sharp? Will the government develop a backbone to remove Sharp itself? And if not, how damaging to the BBC will that end up being? And how much weaker is Sunak going to look as a result? And how, going forwards, can anyone have any trust in the BBC at all, or in its impartiality? The impartiality at the BBC isn't just important, it is supposed to be a central tenet of that organisation, when trust in the BBC was already low. The Tories ensured they appointed somebody who has been the equivalent of taking a wrecking ball to that, not fixing it. Still, if you want a small sliver of good news to end this video with, whilst I've been writing, Gary Lineker has been reinstated to Match of the Day, along with a BBC announcement that there will be a review of social media guidelines. I wonder what went down in that conversation. It was Tory boy Tim Davie who introduced these media guidelines, incidentally, answerable to Tory boy Richard Sharp as he is. So you can blame them for all this disruption to weekend sport programming on the BBC as well. But the first question popping into my head is, how independent is that review going to be? Is there anyone at the BBC without links to the Tories or Richard Sharp left to do it? And I'm sure I won't be the only one thinking that either. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this vid, please do hit like and subscribe, leave a comment and hit the notification bell too so you don't miss the next one. Also look out for me on social media and other interesting stuff by clicking on that Linktree link in the comments below, and I will see you next time. Cheers, folks.